We have to make a decision as ordinary working people that we must organize for a political, economic, and social alternative.
It's actually Stalinism itself that has prevented so many people from drawing the same conclusions that Lenin drew.
The limits of this planet are the limits also of capitalism.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. We discuss pressing issues, highlight current events and active struggles, answer questions, and we bring the lessons of history to the present day. World to Win is hosted by the International Socialist Alternative, an organization made up of sections in more than 30 countries and existing on every continent. We don't just make this show. We're actively organizing in workplaces and communities every day. We're living in an era of one crisis tumbling right into the next, a deadly pandemic into a global depression.
This is a far, far more serious crisis for their system than that.
A global depression into potential climate chaos. Yet, at the same time, we're witnessing a momentous return of the labor movement, of workplace organizing, with more people getting up and getting involved every day.
Tens of thousands of people are going out to protest every week.
We need to rise to meet these new challenges. Tune in every Sunday to hear socialists from across the world talk about what's happening now and where to go next. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!
Welcome back to episode 2 of the International Socialist Alternatives World to Win. My name is Toya. I'm a member of the ISA in the United States, and today we have an exciting show with speakers discussing events happening on 3 different continents. Please take a moment to share this broadcast and be sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell so you can know when we post new content. So today we'll be continuing our discussion that we had last week about racism, as we have seen a movement against police brutality and racism have hit every major city in the United States following the brutal murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We'll also be discussing a new plan to save the European Union. Then we'll be talking about the situation in Hong Kong. And of course, as always, we have our shout out of the week at the end, featuring one section of the International Socialist Alternative, an inspiring story of how the working class is able to and equipped to decide how we should handle a crisis. So we're going to have a chance for you to engage with our speakers, and they're going to answer some of your questions. So please be sure to ask them in the comment section, and we'll be sure to get to it. Now, let's introduce our first 2 speakers. First, from Minneapolis, a socialist alternative member named Ginger. Hey, Ginger. And also another socialist alternative member in Germany, we have Sebastian. How's it going, Sebastian? Let's get started. I want to start actually with Ginger. Last week, we talked about the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and the senseless acts of violence that disproportionately affect Black and Brown people in the US. Now we see protests across the country. I mean, I'm sure there's one happening right now. Many happening right now, really. Ginger, can you describe for our viewers what has happened in just 1 week?
Sure. Thank you, Toya. Yeah, it's really been a wild week in Minneapolis. And by now, I think most know the story of George Floyd. But just to clarify, he was heinously murdered by police in a diverse working class part of South Minneapolis on Monday afternoon. And police were responding to a call that someone had tried to use a fake $20 bill. They weren't even sure if it was George Floyd, which I think recalls very unfortunately the murders of Alton Sterling and Eric Garner and others who were murdered at the hands of police for crimes of poverty and added to a list of names in the Black Lives Matter movement that have rocked the country with these mass mobilizations demanding justice. And since Tuesday evening, there was an occupation around the 3rd Precinct and other satellite protests that sparked thousands of people to action. In the first 24 hours, 10,000 people took to the streets to protest. And really, the main demands at this moment have been that the county attorney indict all 4 officers involved in the murder of George Floyd. One officer was arrested midweek, Derek Chauvin, and this was after protests had gone to his house, and protests had gone to Mike Freeman's house, the Hennepin County attorney, who would be responsible for what charges were brought. And at this point, we've only seen third-degree manslaughter charges brought against Derek Chauvin. The occupations have been 24 hours around the 3rd precinct. On, I think it was Thursday night, the 3rd precinct was overwhelmed and the police retreated. And the protests escalated and took over the precinct. And many people, I think, will have seen also images on social media of businesses and the precinct burning. And the reality of what we've seen, while the political establishment wants to highlight the looting that's taking place, is we've seen multiracial, multi-generational protests and movements with a lot of young immigrant people of color on the front lines there too, and a lot of working class people, it's not just about the looting part of it, but the fact that working class people are gathering supplies. And what we saw in many cases was carts being filled with diapers, with food. And I think it's really an indictment of the political establishment in the city of Minneapolis. Over the last 2 nights, the National Guard was called out by the governor, who actually had the gall to say that we are bringing the full force of goodness and righteousness to restore order on the streets of the city. This is now happening in protests that have spread across the country. Seattle, a 12-year-old was maced by police, and in Houston, 200 people were arrested. I think this is an incredible failure of the political establishment. In cities where top to bottom, they're run by the Democratic Party, it is outrageous that they have resorted to fear-mongering about the protests and sent out the military to crack skulls instead of rooting out the out-of-control policing and deep inequality that exists in our cities. This is happening in the context of Black communities facing 3 times higher infection from the coronavirus and 6 times higher death rates. Some of this is because, many of them are frontline workers, but that immediately speaks to the need to nationalize the healthcare system and the supply chains, as has been discussed around the coronavirus crisis. We are facing over 100,000 deaths in the United States at this point. The fact that the political establishment believes that the correct response is to arrest protesters, is to fearmonger about white supremacists, and is to bring out the military is just disgusting and egregious. I think, all of this could have been avoided with the arrest and charging of all 4 officers involved. And this is why I think we're seeing no trust in Mayor Jacob Fry and no trust in Trump's FBI in this case. I think that this requires actually discussing what the next steps are in the movement. And I think along with prosecuting the police, we need to talk about coordinated and mobilized mass days of action, mass protests across the country. We need to talk about launching and electing a community-led restructuring of the response, and having an actual community-led control board over the police that has hiring and firing powers, the power to subpoena through this process. And really, I think all of this is linked to an indictment of the capitalist system. This police violence is intrinsic to the blood of the capitalist system. And the fact that we're looking at nearly 40 million people unemployed in the context of the coronavirus, which has disproportionately impacted communities of color. We need to talk about what it's going to take to actually have democratic oversight over how the economy is run, because I don't think we would be looking at the deep racial and economic inequality that we have right now in the United States, that, if we were actually running the economy in the interests of working people. And I think there's a real risk right now that ongoing protests without a sustained and coordinated structure end up losing momentum. But I think a well-organized mass movement can begin to address this structural racism and inequality that surrounds this police violence and take up demands for social programs, public education, and permanently affordable housing. The liberal establishment has again proven itself completely incapable of combating the right and addressing the situation. And so this is why I think we're talking about actually the total transformation of society in this case and an indictment of the system overall. These are the types of discussions that are happening, even while the immediate demands are around indicting the 4 officers. I think a lot of the community mobilization that is going on right now has been around cleaning up the city. It shows what's possible. It shows that working people can actually lead the response and change the situation that we're facing around the racism of the capitalist system in the labor movement. We saw actually that it, attracted a lot of attention, that some bus drivers, including members of Socialist Alternative, had, refused to cart protesters away from arrested, by the MPD, the Minneapolis Police Department, and instead they were standing with the protesting youth and with the working class people who were trying to build a mass response, calling for the officers to be indicted. And that's the type of role, that's the cutting edge role that the labor movement organized can play in trying to get justice for George Floyd.
Thanks so much, Ginger. And I mean, it's inspirational what's happening there. Like we talked about, there's massive protests that are happening across the country. But last week in our show, when we were talking a little bit about the Black Lives Matter movement, one thing that we were discussing was the need to take up more demands and how to take the movement further. Right now, we are seeing a whole new movement, a multiracial movement that isn't just about racism. It's about police brutality in general, which can then lead to questions about why the police are like this, the role of the police. But Minneapolis is an interesting place. You have this strong labor history there. We know that the Teamsters Rebellion that happened in the 30s, and we can thank a lot of the laws that we have, the labor laws that we have, to the city of Minneapolis. How does that legacy in the labor movement, how will that help the fight against police brutality?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The 1934 Teamsters strike really was a turning point in the labor movement in the U.S. And back in that rebellion, the National Guard was also mobilized to suppress the strike, along with help from deputized youth from the upper and middle class families in Minneapolis at the time. And they shot, a lot of the striking Teamsters. They terrorized strike organizers' families, and they arrested the entire leadership of the Teamsters at that time. But it was ineffective in part because of the deep organizing and the democratic structures that were engaged in the movement. And because of the socialists who played key roles in that and saw the need to really link up and deepen the struggle with the unemployed, with the Teamsters families, with unorganized workers. And I think that that's the type of thing that we're talking about right now. What can defeat the repression that we're currently experiencing? What can overcome the battles of the right, or battles, the threat of the right wing? And I think what are ways to organize real responses to public safety? And sort of as I implied before, thousands of people in Minneapolis are having those types of discussion right now, and working class communities are organizing cleanups of the neighborhoods after some of the fires, and they're notifying each other about potential threats. They're getting organized and talking about how to keep people safe from the National Guard or threats of vigilante violence. And in a lot of ways, I think this shows that the local labor movement can play an active role in that process as well. Again, like I said about the bus drivers in ATU Local 1005, really showed a powerful example. And days later, or I think like a day later, a New York bus driver at one of the big protests initially in response and solidarity to the murder of George Floyd also refused to drive arrested protesters to jail. So we're seeing that kind of across the country, including in Minnesota. The Minnesota nurses and the Minnesota teachers have issued statements. But I think a lot of this, shows that the deeper organizing necessary means getting into unemployed communities, being out on the front lines and organizing genuine grassroots response with the organized structures that the labor movement has to really, root out the racism in the police department, but more importantly, actually talk about what it would take to reorganize society with the democratic structures necessary to combat the deeply rooted racism of the capitalist system.
Thanks so much, Ginger. I want to now go to Sebastian. We have a comment from Paul in the UK who said hundreds have demonstrated today to protest against the police murder of George Floyd. How are people in Germany and Europe viewing what's happening in Minneapolis?
Yeah, it's been viewed with a lot of interest and a lot of focus. Everyone is watching the news and is shocked at the police violence that is happening there. There have been demonstrations in Germany as well, but there's also kind of a debate amongst some leftists about the riots and what's happening there, and some are starting to, lecture the protesters for their methods, and I think that shows a certain, detachment from the people there on the ground, because I think these riots are just, an angry expression of all the rage that has been building up for years and years, and it's not just, some gangsters, proletarian elements or whatever. It's a huge layer of people that are, actively questioning the authority of the police, and that's quite something. I mean, they have shown and understood that the people can be stronger than even the militarized police in the States. But of course, the movement has to discuss tactics now, and I think we would argue for mass strike action instead of looting, for example, because even if the loot is distributed amongst the neighborhoods in a fine show of solidarity, I think strikes can cause much higher damage to the system than some looted supermarkets and burned apartment buildings and stuff. But I think first and foremost, we should defend the communities that are expressing their anger now. And I think it's ironic that the state institutions are now talking about the violence of the protesters, while they're in the same time shooting and beating and tear gassing and running over protesters. And when they talk about restoring order, I had to think about this. My favorite quote from Rosa Luxemburg, when before, in the last article before she was killed, after the uprising of the workers in Berlin was violently crushed, she wrote, "Order prevails in Berlin, you foolish lackeys, your order is built on sand. Tomorrow the revolution will rise up again, clashing its weapons, and to your horror it will proclaim with trumpets blazing, I am, I was, I am, I shall be." And I think that's one of the most awesome quotes ever, I think.
Thanks so much. Sebastian, though, I do want to ask you, kind of switching a little bit, there's a lot going on with the European Union. Can you update our viewers with what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, from a medical standpoint, an organism in a poor health condition is more susceptible for other external pathogens. In that sense, I think the corona crisis has shown that the bourgeois institutions that were in a bad shape before the outbreak already are now really in a huge crisis. And I mean, the crisis in the EU is a bit boring compared to what's happening in the States. But it's still, I mean, one of the biggest bourgeois formations in the world, and it's just stumbling from crisis to crisis. After they barely prevented Brexit, thanks to the reformist left Syriza, Brexit came, which hit the EU very hard. And people in the internet were making up stupid words for other countries leaving the EU. And the word for Italy was quitterly. And this joke now has become a real threat, because in the wake of the crisis, Italy has had to put enormous means into saving their banking system, which was in crisis for years already, but is now on the brink of collapsing. And the Italian economy is the third biggest one in Europe, and it has now debts of 2.4 trillion euros, which will mount as high as like 200% of their annual GDP. And that's much more than the European Union would want, which would be at around 60%. So now they're discussing what to do with these enormous mountains of debt that will be created in the crisis. And one of the things that they want to do is, increase inflation, basically printing money, so that the value of the debts would decrease. But they wouldn't want to do it like they did in the 20s or 30s with actually printing money. But what they would do is the ECB, the European Central Bank, would buy trillions of bonds from banks and from states. And by that, increasing the amount of money in the financial system. But there's also, they are not really, the member states are not really, they're struggling to find common grounds. And there are four states, the so-called frugal four: Austria, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Denmark. And they are, for example, against the pooling of 500 billion euro. No, I think it's billion euro more debts. I think I mean, there was a ruling of the German Constitutional Court that ruled that the biggest bond buying program of the ECB is basically against the German constitution, because it would threaten the deposits of German pension funds and insurances and stuff. And the rulings of this constitutional court can't be overruled, but neither can the ruling of the European Court of Justice that confirmed the legality of the program. So they have a potentially really big problem there. And you know, all these conflicts are increasing with the crisis. And even if it seems only like a tummy ache compared to the crises in US or in China, I think it can turn into something much more explosive in the coming period. But I wouldn't want to get more graphic than that.
Thanks so much, Sebastian. So that was actually a really good segue into our next piece. We're going to hear about the situation in Hong Kong. Last year, we saw an inspirational movement break out there where millions of people took to the streets fighting to maintain democracy against the Chinese regime. And this struggle has inspired people around the world. I mean, even today in the US, we're seeing people learning how to use the same tactics that the people in Hong Kong used against the police to protect from things like tear gas and pepper spray. So yesterday I got to speak with Pasha, and he sent us a video describing the current situation in Hong Kong right now. So let's take a look.
Hello comrades, I'm Pasha from the China, Hong Kong, Taiwan section of ISA. China's fake parliament, the National People's Congress, or the NPC, has just passed the new national security law for Hong Kong on Thursday. This means that the very limited democratic rights and autonomy of Hong Kong will be smashed by the CCP dictatorship. The Chinese regime previously promised to allow one country, two systems in Hong Kong, which means some elements of bourgeois democracy since the handover from Britain in 1997. Now this was because they wanted to reassure the capitalist class that their investments and profits would be protected and to calm fears among the masses that Hong Kong would become the same totalitarian regime as in China. The new law is a retaliation by the Chinese government to the huge anti-authoritarian movement in Hong Kong last year. It is also a retaliation against the US and other Western governments who want to put all the blame on China for the COVID crisis. Tiananmen Square massacre. The pandemic has caused huge anger in China and mass upheaval is possible to happen. And also, the escalation of the global imperialist power struggle, which many countries are now calling for China to pay compensation for the so-called Chinese virus, makes the Chinese regime look weak. To divert attention at home, Xi Jinping has to show his personal power by taking full control over Hong Kong. Now this new security law will allow Chinese secret police and security agents to operate openly and legally in Hong Kong. They will be China's Gestapo in Hong Kong. They already exist in Hong Kong, but they were underground, and the government have always denied its existence. In 2015, there was a famous case with booksellers kidnapped by Chinese security agents in Hong Kong illegally. .info could also be banned like it is already in China, because we also call for down with the one-party dictatorship. Opposition political parties and organizations will increasingly be disqualified from taking part in elections. Any groups who support the right of self-determination or Hong Kong independence will be accused of splitting the country and can face life sentence. There will be increasing censorship. Press freedom has already declined to a global ranking of 80 out of 180 countries from only 58 in 2013, according to Reporters Without Borders. Now the law will ban activities of foreign and external forces, so they will strike against all forms of international solidarity, but also to make an example of those sections of the protest movement that have aligned themselves with foreign governments, such as pro-US and pro-British groups. The Chinese government increasingly blame foreign forces for supporting the anti-government protests and attempt to use Chinese nationalism to divert attention. They want to tell the people in mainland China that the movement in Hong Kong is anti-China and a plot by the USA. Socialists explain that the US capitalists and other governments have no interest in supporting the democratic right in Hong Kong, China, or even in Alabama or Minnesota. Now, the US props up murderous dictatorship like Saudi Arabia. The US and the EU has close links with the CCP dictatorship for decades because they welcomed China's return to capitalism and the huge economic benefit this gave to the Western companies. But illusions in the US are likely to grow within sections of the Hong Kong protest movement now because the new law has passed. The dictatorship policies become a self-fulfilling prophecy. There was no terrorism in Xinjiang, and extreme forms of religion were rare. But the CCP manufactured the threat of terrorism in order to justify its brutal repression in Xinjiang, and this in turn caused a big increase in religious fundamentalism as a backlash. Now, the new national security law in Hong Kong can drive more people into the false idea that Trump and the US are on the side of the struggle. The masses in Hong Kong are extremely angry over this new national security law. The mass protests last year lasted over 7 months, with 1 out of 4 in the whole population marching on the streets. The only response from the Chinese government was even more hardline repression. Now, the Chinese government cannot afford to show any weakness because they fear that if they make any concessions to the movement in Hong Kong, the mainland Chinese working class will feel that it is possible to fight the regime and win. So the movement may spread to mainland China and threaten the rule of the regime. Since the new security law is announced, new protests have erupted in Hong Kong. The mass anger is so extreme that another million-strong protest would have happened if only the government could not use the social distancing rules to ban protests. There is a mood that this is the final battle and that we have nothing to lose anymore. This drives a significant layer of protesters chanting slogans including Hong Kong independence, because people feel that the Chinese dictatorship will not allow any autonomy nor legal protest anyway, so they are pushed to be more provocative. Hong Kong has become a battleground of the new Cold War between China and US. While Trump does not care about democratic rights in Hong Kong and China, he increasingly wants to use the Hong Kong issue to put pressure onto the Chinese government for purpose of blocking the imperialist ambitions of China which challenge US power. Now, it is likely that US will enforce economic sanctions at least for some time by claiming that Hong Kong is no longer a separate trade entity from China. The illusions towards US can demobilize the struggle in Hong Kong. It will also allow the CCP dictatorship to play the nationalism card by saying that the movement in Hong Kong is pro-US, pro-imperialism, and anti-China, undermining the support from mainland Chinese masses. It is still not sure if these protests can develop into a new wave of mass movements. Sure, it is possible, but the police are much more hardline and are prepared to attack the anarchistic method of the struggle, which is embraced by the vast majority of the youth in the movement. On the 27th of May, 600 protesters were arrested in one day. Socialist Action argues that the direction of the movement must be turned towards methods of working class organized struggle and be linked to a socialist program to fight not only the dictatorship but also capitalism. We say the struggle can only win if it spreads to China. We call for united struggle on both sides of the border by workers who are suffering from the pandemic and also the economic collapse. This, rather than the false hopes in capitalists and foreign powers, is the way to win. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks, Pasha. I also got to speak to Vincent of chinaworker.info, and I asked him, why has the Chinese regime decided to act now? Clearly the international situation is a big factor. Let's hear what Vincent had to say.
Hello, Toya. This new law means the end of Hong Kong's partial autonomy, the one country, two systems arrangement. That's got huge global implications. Hong Kong is the main financial center in Asia. But if, as is possible, the US now cancels Hong Kong's separate trade status in retaliation for China's enactment of the new security law, that would abolish a series of trade and tax benefits which could see the unraveling of Hong Kong as a financial center. We're in a new Cold War, a brutal struggle for global supremacy between US and Chinese imperialism, which spans everything: trade, finance, technology, and of course the pandemic. As ISA has explained, we're no longer in the era of capitalist globalization. We're in an era where geoeconomics take primacy. It's an era of economic warfare. It's no longer just short-term profits that are driving policy, but more and more it's about the fundamental national interests, issues of regime survival and system survival. So if we ask, why did China do this? I think the answer is that the regime is under extreme pressure from an internal and an external crisis, and Xi Jinping himself is increasingly exposed. He's not as strong and stable as most commentators would have us believe. Last year was a pretty disastrous year for the Chinese regime, with the trade war, the Hong Kong protests, of course, and also, very importantly, what happened in Taiwan, which is a nightmare development for Beijing. And if we look back to January this year, with the CCP's mishandling of the initial coronavirus outbreak, let's remember they wasted precious weeks. That caused an explosion of anger and demands for free speech and democracy in China. This was just 3 months ago. The regime actually lost control of things for a week or so. It was a huge crisis. But then they were rescued by Trump, by Boris, by the EU and other governments who made an even bigger mess of dealing with the pandemic. The Chinese regime was astonished as the news came in from Italy, Spain, especially from the US, where you have a president who first was in total denial and then began promoting anti-science ideas. So despite the widespread discontent and fear in China as a result of the pandemic, people looked at the US and Europe and said, those governments are even worse. Xi is still under very, very big pressure, and of course, not least from the collapsing economy. There's never been an economic slump like there is now since China reverted to capitalism, not since the 1970s. So this is why Xi Jinping chose to get tough on Hong Kong. It's a power demonstration. And partially, it's a diversionary maneuver to shift attention from his own mistakes. This was also a message to the masses in China, even to vacillating elements within the Chinese ruling class and state, that Xi's regime won't brook a challenge from any quarter. In Hong Kong, the protest movement could relaunch itself, but it urgently needs a new direction because the current battle is not equal. It's like a very heroic cat trying to wrestle down an elephant. There's a need to build workers' organisations, trade unions and a socialist party to prepare for strikes in a serious way. Any worker who's been out on strike knows it's not enough to come out. You need a strategy for the strike. You need strong organisation in a factory or office across the whole industry. Unfortunately, we don't have that yet in Hong Kong. The mass movement needs to change focus to try to encourage and link up with a movement among the Chinese working class, which is now facing huge wage cuts. 80 million are now unemployed in China. This is the number one nightmare for the dictatorship. Then we see the international dimension. I think that there could be quite significant countermeasures by the Trump administration because of the new security law. And this has probably been underestimated by Xi Jinping and the ruling group. Trump is under massive pressure from Congress, and the elections are only months away. 70% of Americans in one opinion poll want US companies to pull out of China. A similar figure blamed China for COVID-19. In fact, the conspiracy theory that Trump has more or less endorsed, that China created the new coronavirus in a lab in Wuhan, there was a poll showing that 1 in 4 Americans believe this to be true. Now, Hong Kong has been hugely profitable for the Chinese dictatorship. It was a crucial conduit which made the restoration of capitalism possible in China, bringing billions of dollars of investment from the Chinese capitalist diaspora back into China, in collusion with the CCP's own capitalist progeny. Most of this traffic went through Hong Kong. The West, the US, the EU, they've all supported and profited from this process for decades. They toned down all criticism of the Chinese regime on the issue of human rights. And they held up the fairy story that this capitalist development would lead to a more democratic development in China. They never believed that themselves. This was just to try to silence those who questioned why they were being so meek towards the dictatorship. Well, that era is well and truly over. The pandemic has seen a dramatic escalation of the conflict between the US and China, and it goes far beyond Trump and his nationalism. In fact, the Chinese regime might actually prefer Trump to win the election because they fear a democratic administration could be even worse, that it would avoid some of Trump's idiocy, perhaps be more skillful in knitting together a global coalition against China. So what's happening in Hong Kong is quite historic. It's a turning point. This is now a key battleground in the new Cold War, and it shows the urgent need to build an international socialist alternative to organise struggle against all the imperialist powers, whether authoritarian or allegedly democratic capitalist governments. Both, of course, are the enemies of the working class.
Thank you so much, fellas, for those updates. Now, I want to take some time to answer some comments and questions. So please participate with us. Add your questions, add your comments, and hopefully we can get a chance to have our speakers answer them. First, we have Yara in the UK who asked about protesting during the age of Corona. And I think this is a real question. We're living in a completely changed situation. I mean, here in my city in Boston, every single person has a mask on at these protests because that's the law right now. You have to wear a mask when you leave your house. What about in your country? At the solidarity protests for George Floyd, are people wearing masks? Let us know. But I want to switch to Ginger. Many young people, Ginger, were not a part of the Black Lives Matter movement that happened after, the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. They were just children, but now they're 15 years old and they themselves are calling some of these protests. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the youth in this fight against police brutality?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important to highlight just how young and how dynamic the protests have been. And I think what we're seeing is a generation that has been dramatically radicalized through the environmental crisis and the impending climate catastrophe. And overall, a situation where I think the slogan that originated with the Black Lives Matter movement, really rings true. The idea that the whole system is guilty, that the whole system and the future that these young people face is actually one of poverty wages, of a lack of affordable housing, of rising rents. And when we talk about who's actually looting in the situation right now, the fact that the richest people in the United States have gotten $434 billion richer, many people are pointing out that this is actually where the looting of our economy is coming from. The fact that with the coronavirus crisis, we're going to be facing a question of who actually pays, and will we be, like the recession of 2008, be saddled with greater debts, with a foreclosure crisis, people getting kicked out of their homes, that type of a thing in the coming months. And I think that this is the situation. Young people who have been growing up with families struggling under the burden of these low-wage jobs and a political establishment who often stands in the way of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, who wrings their hands when they're faced with a question of trying to root out the racism of the local police force. I think this is the type of thing that is radicalizing young people, and the sort of anxiety that we all have about whether or not we're going to have a planet to continue living on in the next several years. Will you be killed by climate catastrophe or at the hands of brutal police force in the United States? And I think that this really calls into question what we can do to actually address this. And I think that the mobilization of young people, the militancy that young people have shown in this movement so far, really points in the direction for the need for this to have a mass expression. There needs to be community organizing, the community structures that have already begun to grow through the course of this need to get connected in a national and in an international way, so that we can build the mass movements needed to overcome the impotency of the political establishment. Because we're going to have to wage a political struggle here. And I think these young people linking up these demands to the broader social demands, the things that they're talking about on the front lines, the need for higher wages, the need for affordable housing, all of that, the type of foundational change that we are not finding under the capitalist system, that this is a way of starting to address the poverty and the issues that exist in various communities that also suffer from over-policing and the racism that's inherent to the capitalist system.
Thank you so much, Ginger. I have another question for you. One of the demands that we're seeing come out is this issue of cutting the police budgets. Right now in this age of Corona, where we have this looming Great Depression ahead, or recession, we're already seeing austerity budgets being put forward in cities. And a lot of these austerity budgets are cuts from our public schools and upping the police budget. And so how can we engage with people, and what's your take on this demand of defund the police or cut the police budget?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because actually in 2018, much of the sitting city council in Minneapolis that doesn't know what to do right now, and can't back, or they claim that they can't actually back the protests that are having an enormous radicalization on the rest of the country as well, and talking about what we can do next. They actually voted for a massive increase in the police budget, while for-profit developers have a disproportionate impact and influence in the back rooms of City Hall. And we're seeing nothing but luxury development happening in the city of Minneapolis. They're also attempting to brutally privatize public housing here. And this is the situation that they create, and then they act like they have no idea why young people and working class people in the city are just like viscerally angry at the fact that another unarmed Black man has been killed here. So I think that, like, in a lot of ways, when we talk about defunding the police, we are talking about the structural priorities of the liberal political establishment. And this is why I think we need an independent political alternative built of, by, and for working class people in Minneapolis and across the rest of the United States. I think it is an important priority to talk about how we could actually build socially owned and organized affordable housing in our cities and in all major cities across the country. How we can talk about actually building a healthcare system that's affordable and democratically run and organized by working people. These are the type of things, a budget reflects the priorities of the local, government or what have you. And so I think for us, this is, again, it's a political struggle that we are waging. To talk about defunding the police is an important step in the process of organizing. And it's understandable that right now, most of the demands are around indicting the police officers. We should be talking also about what does it look like to fight for the public education that we need and the funding that we need. And especially in the age of coronavirus, I think, we cannot let the political establishment blame us for Wall Street's errors. We have to absolutely fight for tooth and nail funding for, the health response that we need, and that can be democratically run and organized by working people. And that's, I think, the situation we're in right now. And I think partly why, increased organizing is completely necessary. This also means that we actually have to talk about a root and branch restructuring of, the Minneapolis Police Department. And again, I think we're talking about not just a restructuring of the department, but building a community oversight that has real teeth. And that's the type of thing that the establishment has been resistant to for many, many years. They never combat the police department. They never confront the police department, and instead just keep giving them money and then, give us crocodile tears every time, someone in the community is murdered at the hands of police. So I think that, again, we're talking about mass coordinated days of action to plan for the next steps in the movement, to demand the type of independent forces that are necessary to win a restructuring of our budget priorities across the entire country, and frankly, to defend working class communities. And I think a lot of the labor movement can play a role in this as well, which I think is a huge part of what we're talking about going forward. The last thing I'll say about that, it's a little bit to the side of the question, but we saw, in Minneapolis yesterday, a video went around of a lot of people in the Somali community defending one of the Somali malls where a lot of people do their shopping, and they were defending them against a couple of white guys that they were not sure who they were, and they were acting suspiciously, and were kind of so the community was afraid that they might be trying to set fires. And the reality is the community pushed them out, and were able to do that without using rubber bullets and tear gas canisters. So this clearly shows that we can democratically organize things within our communities in a way that builds the right kind of response And yet at the same time, I think we have to challenge the democratic political establishment, because they're going to keep doing the same things over and over again, like giving millions of dollars to the police department, if we don't fundamentally, deepen the organizing necessary to turn that into a real kind of political fight.
Thanks, Ginger. And yeah, it's important to highlight that it's, the state that's using this violence. Working class people know how to, protect ourselves and defend ourselves without using this type of violence. I want to broaden out the discussion a little bit more, though, and ask Sebastian. I'm seeing a lot of stuff online about, in these types of movements, outside agitators. So I was wondering if you could answer, what role are they playing, and what can we do about them, not just in regards to Minneapolis, but more broadly speaking?
Yeah, I think I'd go even a bit further and make the connection back to Hong Kong, because I've seen a lot of people on social media talk about, let's not talk about Hong Kong, let's talk about Minneapolis, and I think that's the wrong perspective. I mean, because what they mean is that when the media is talking about the movement in Hong Kong, it's done from a foreign interventionist perspective in a way. But I think you have to see it from a class perspective. And even if there's some protesters in Hong Kong that have illusions in the US helping them out and so on, I think we have to defend their protests for democratic rights, and I think it would be a bit of a lazy analysis to boil down the contradiction in Hong Kong to just geopolitics. And I mean, of course, it plays a role. Hong Kong has become the battlefield in this new Cold War right now between the two superpowers. But the protests are not orchestrated from the outside. They come from the aspirations of the people themselves. And even if we don't agree with their tactics or their hope towards Trump and stuff like that, I think it's a living movement, and we can only intervene in it when we refer to it in a positive manner. And I think consciousness is nothing static. It can change with the experiences that prove that ideas that might have been on the fridge before, and that would then, get a mass basis. And I think a class perspective wouldn't provide support for a movement only on the condition that the movement is in line with what we would wish for. But we have to look at the potential of what's happening. And our comrades on the ground report that the potential is there for a new chapter of the movement in Hong Kong. And that it would, if it would spread to China, challenging the one-party dictatorship of the so-called Communist Party, that is, as communist as Joe Biden is black, I'd say. If the huge Chinese working class would challenge the super exploitation that they're facing and stuff, this would open up a completely new chapter of the global class struggle.
Thanks so much, Sebastian. That was great. There's been so many memes going around about Joe Biden, so that was a great one. Thank you for that. And I want to thank both of our speakers for participating with us today. Now on to the shout out of the week. So we have our section of International Socialist Alternative called PSL. They are in Belgium, and we're going to talk about the healthcare workers' struggle and victory. The Belgian healthcare workers, they defeated attacks on their working conditions after a whole series of dramatic mistakes around providing PPE and failing to provide protective measures for nursing homes, which we know were affected the most by the COVID crisis. The Belgian minority government, which was granted special powers by Parliament to fight the COVID crisis, they launched an attack on working conditions of healthcare workers. And so what workers saw were enforceable fines and even imprisonment. And another one making it possible for non-authorized healthcare professionals to perform nursing acts, which is crazy scary. And they were effectively attacking the basis of the profession of healthcare. And so this was completely unnecessary, especially since in all regions of the country, we saw an army of volunteers, multiple thousands of people with some sort of certificate or diploma who are not currently active in the healthcare sector. These people had made themselves available to help. And so the action of the staff of the Brussels St. Pierre Hospital during Prime Minister, here I go, Wilmes's visit struck like a bomb throughout the country and beyond, because these healthcare workers turned their back to him, which is absolutely amazing. So while the government seemed unsure how to respond, the energy minister decided to add insult to injury by calling the action at the hospital that of spoiled children who don't get their way. Can you believe that they're calling healthcare workers who are on the front line spoiled children? This prompted all trade unions on the French-speaking side of the country, one after the other, to call for strike action in the healthcare sector. And barely 2 days later, the minority government announced that they would withdraw these policies. So the call for a large demonstration by and for healthcare after the lockdown is gaining support in the whole country and could be a major step in the fight against budget cuts in public services in general. So I want to give solidarity to the healthcare workers in Belgium who fight every single day, not just for the needs of their workforce, but for the health and safety of their patients. This is the type of work that the International Socialist Alternative does. We engage and we're active in worker struggles, we're active in our unions, and we're active in social movements, as we discussed here today. And we understand the role that capitalism plays in the exploitation and the oppression of the working class. And that's why we are fighting for a complete transformation of society. We are fighting for a socialist future for our children and for our planet. If you agree, please check out our website and join the International Socialist Alternative in your country. See you all next week, same time, same place.